Well, thank you very much. I'm glad that the hall is warmer here than it was in the Bonar Hall for our conference, where cuts at Dundee University seem to have gone to a ridiculous situation. I've obviously been asked about the Alba vision. I would say the Alba vision, I think, is the vision that most of us, I think, in this room will have for Scotland. It's not some Valhalla that is over the rainbow and unobtainable. It's not some utopian vision. It's a country Scotland could be. It's a country Scotland should be. The tragedy for Scotland is not how bad things are. They are, of course, for a third of our people who live in grinding poverty. But for those of us in this room, I would imagine there'll be some here suffering from poverty. But a lot of us actually we're doing okay. We could probably do a hell of a lot better, but we're doing okay. We live in a lovely country. I certainly am fortunate to spare my time between Dunbar and Speyside. So the tragedy of Scotland is not how bad things are, it's how much better they should be. And the tragedy of Scotland is that we have simply failed to deliver for our people. Other countries have done so much more with so much less. We can look at Norway, and of course they have got the oil, and we just have to look with green envy at what they've done with a $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund, and indeed unparalleled wealth in comparison to what we face. But equally, it's others who didn't have that. Others, whether it's Ireland, whether it's Denmark, whether it's the Baltic states that have come out of post-Soviet era, they have all bias. I was chatting to Ian Grant. I know his son's coming over from Ireland tomorrow. I remember going to my best friend from university, who eventually retired as Director General of TG Cahir, the Irish Language Channel. I remember going to his wedding in the west of Ireland, and it was either 85 or 86. And I actually saw the best political billboard advert I've ever seen. It was simply an Irish passport. And underneath it said, there has to be a better way. It was Vote Fianna Fáil, the Republican Party, because they were opposing the Fine Gael Labour administration. But it said everything, because at that point, everybody, especially young people, were leaving Ireland. The brain drain was on. Ireland turned it round. They don't have the universities that we have. They didn't have the education system that we had. They haven't had the blessings of oil and now renewables, certainly not to the extent that we have, and yet they turned it round. They did make mistakes. Independent countries make mistakes. The fall of the Celtic Tiger. But they weren't rescued from Brussels or rescued from London or rescued from New York or Washington. They sorted it out themselves. Other countries, similarly, Denmark has far less than us in terms of all those things that I've mentioned. And many of you here will have had a long history in the SNP, and you'll remember Chris McLean, who was the Director of Communications and was with the party through thick and thin in many years from the 70s through to the 80s. He's one of those people who moved to Estonia. I first went there in 1996. It was 4 years out of the Soviet yoke, and believe me, it was a Soviet yoke. It wasn't pleasant for Estonia being a Soviet socialist republic, not what was being done to their environment. It was obviously a post-Soviet economy. I was back there last year, and the wealth and affluence in Tallinn is significantly greater than what I see in the streets of Edinburgh or of Glasgow. They are, how is it that Estonia, lacking all those things that we have, has managed to achieve that? So the only answer is that they are independent nations. They can track their own future. They can make their own way. And that's the difference between us. I also remember once when I travelled with John Swinney, I think he was meeting Bertie Ahern and I was meeting other people. I remember meeting the Director General of Bord Felcha, the Irish Tourist Board. And I remember him saying, it always stuck with me because it wounded me. But he basically said, your scenery is grander and more majestic. Your history is less bloody and less frightening. You screw it up. Keep it up, lads. People choose to go golf tours to Ireland because it's cheaper and because they advertise better. They're taking us to the cleaners in so many ways and have been for so long. We should be able to punch well above our weight, and the problem is we have punched significantly below it. But the vision I have is of the country that Scotland should be, because we do have two, huge bounties, oil and gas, never mind renewables, but there are other aspects. I was driving through Dundee and seeing the benefits that you do have of having universities. In Ireland and Denmark and certainly Estonia don't have the university advantages that we have, not just from the ancients, but you see what's been done in the gaming industry with Abertay. The huge opportunities, the spin-offs in Dundee, despite the difficulties that the university faces, are significant. Scotland should be doing so much better. But I want to focus on the two real issues of oil and gas that hasn't gone away, and indeed renewables. Because oil and gas, first of all, we were told in 2014 that it was all but gone, and that was it. And if Scotland became an independent nation, then oil and gas would be a burden that we'd be unable to care for. We were told in the last election that it would be changed and Labour would save Grangemouth refinery. Scotland now is the only major oil-producing nation that does not have a refinery capacity. We are a country that is akin to Trinidad and Tobago, to New Zealand, to the Republic of Congo, that are oil producers but do not have a refinery capacity. None of those countries are in the top 25. Scotland's in at number 21 on its own, not as part of the United Kingdom, because their oil and gas wealth is very, very limited indeed. And yet we've seen the closure of our refinery. Labour promised to save it. They ignored the pleas of the workers. They ignored the pleas of business. Because if you speak to the chief executives of the airport, they will tell you that Grangemouth refinery provided the aviation fuel not simply for every airplane and airport in Scotland, but indeed for Newcastle. They now have to reconfigure their whole hubs. And that's also not by the lie that Grangemouth wasn't making money. It was making money. Not as much as the owners wanted, but it was making money. Nobody says that it has to be here forever. At some stage, it was ageing. It would have to have been either closed or changed, and certainly refineries are far, far bigger than that one that started out 100 years ago with the origins of BP, but it should have been retained to be able to transition. You know, the British blame rests with the British government, but we cannot exculpate the Scottish government either, because I remember speaking to the then General Secretary or Regional Secretary in Scotland of Unite the Union, our biggest union, I think, about what's our biggest industrial closure in 20 years. And when he phoned the Scottish Government Energy Secretary, he was offered a meeting of half an hour in 3 weeks, to which I said, that is insulting. It never took place. The Scottish Government has now realised that blame should have been tried. I mean, my criticism in some ways of the SNP on Grangemouth was it reminds me of what Jimmy Reid used to say about Arthur Scargill. He didn't mind him being a militant. He objected him to be an idiotic militant. And to some extent, I have no objection to the Scottish National Party government criticising the Labour government in London, because that's where blame really does rest. But equally, they failed to put that blame there. Michael Matheson knew for some 3 years and didn't bell the cat. The Scottish Government wasn't doing anything. Local representatives weren't even speaking to the elected shop stewards, never mind Unite the Union. That was a shameful failure. And people will say, oh, well, you know, it was environmentally damaging. Do you realise the Forties field and the Forties pipeline still runs from the coast out to Grangemouth? The Finnart pipeline goes from Finnart and the Clyde to Grangemouth. Anybody, and there used to be an old guy in North Berwick who didn't like me and would write and say, but what about the environmental damage? Isn't it good that it's closed? I never bothered writing back to him, just to wind him up. Believe you me, the environmental damage that Scotland is going to suffer because of super tankers going up and down the Clyde and the Forth is going to be significantly greater than the emissions that ever came from Grangemouth. They will dwarf what we have because the oil has to be taken out and other oil has to be brought in, and it comes in not just to the Forth to Hunter's Point, it comes into Finnart in the Clyde up by the Holy Loch, and there's a pipeline there that takes it to Grangemouth. So as I say, that simply shouldn't be happening. We should be seeing Rosebank developed. I do realise that we have to move away from fossil fuels. We do have to, for the sake of our planet, change. But the oil reserves are there. They should be used for our nation to allow us to have a just transition. As it is at the moment, there is an unjust transition. And if you speak to RMT and Unite, it's simply about job losses and job closures. There is despair. And, you know, Aberdeen, that I remember as a prosperous city, now almost has tumbleweed rolling through it because I go there to see my stepdaughter, who's a teacher there. It simply shouldn't be happening. We have to ensure Rosebank's developed. We do have to look at carbon capture. We have to make sure that we keep the industry going, even although we do know it will have to change. But the renewable sector is where Scotland should be really able to motor. That should be our blessing. Now, I've been reading the stuff in the Herald with interest. I saw Brian Wilson. I do feel like saying to Brian Wilson, I agree with what he's written. I don't agree with Brian Wilson. It would have been nice if he'd actually given some credit that myself and the Alba party raised this some 3 years ago when it first happened. I remember discussing it with Kate Forbes, who told me it had been signed off and she had nothing to do. At the end of the day, it shouldn't have been signed off, and it might not have been her blame, but somebody somewhere in the Scottish Government should have been saying this Dutch auction, because you will know that most of us who go to an auction, you expect to have higher bids. I've got some sympathy with the Scottish Government because they did follow on about what had been down south of the border, where you cap it. This is the maximum you can bid. But, you know, when you dig down the expectations, the outcome, as Brian Wilson has pointed out, is that Nicola Sturgeon went out and said how glorious it was that we had sold off the ScotWind rights for $800 million. Within some 2 or 3 months, the state of New York sold off 25% of what we sold off for $4.3 billion. Anybody who says, but the American energy market is bigger, no, it's not. Because Scotland's part of the European energy market. The energy that we produce is capable of being sent to Germany as it is capable of being sent to England. Because not only do we have links that go down through Scotland to England, there are also links, and indeed in future, further such links will be made, go through Norway, so you route down through Scandinavia, because at some stage or other, Germany's probably going to make a decision that it would be better to buy clean energy from Scotland than rest on trying to buy energy from Putin or wherever. But that's where we're at. The ScotWind auction was a farce. I remember putting down some questions about, we were told that the benefit of the renewable sector was that, well, we'd get the supply jobs. Well, I asked about how we would do that assessment. How do you assess what's the percentage? Because the reason you got the bid was you'd promised to do 50% or 60% supply job. And I remember asking, I think it was SSEN, what happens if you import a turbine from Teesside or from the Netherlands or from Indonesia and you assemble it in Scotland? What percentage is attributed to the assembly and what percentage is attributed to the construction? And the answer was, that's an interesting question. How will that be addressed? Well, it's self-assessment. And I remember thinking to myself, well, self-assessment works very well with the banks. This idea that SSEN, Scottish Power, Vattenfall, anybody else is going to say, actually, 50% of our supply chain was in Scotland. Who decides? They decide. There's apparently a man or a woman or a dog somewhere in Victoria Quay that will check it. But there's also no powers if it's not dealt with. So the saving grace, and I know this from people who are heavily involved in the sector, is a lot of the ScotWind auction is not going to be processed in time because there's a window that they have to carry out the works, and if they don't, then it falls back in. What we have to do is to ensure that when it comes back in, we actually get that benefit. We should be doing, I know Denmark tried to get 30% of a stake and everything, it's not mad at the moment. At some stage it will come about. We do have to have a Scottish energy company, not for a supply to our people, but to take control of our asset, to take a share in every offshore wind farm. I'll concentrate on offshore wind farms because I think there's differences about onshore. We should be proceeding there, taking that share, but we've also got to make sure that we get the work, both in construction and in supply chain. Let me just digress to say about onshore. I think the time has come to say no more with regard to onshore. Yes, with regard to small-scale community, but onshore, what we are seeing with onshore at the present moment is, I'm old enough to remember when Terry Wogan, Kenny Dalglish and others were buying and planting trees in the Flow country or wherever else. It didn't matter what tree, any tree, they got tax abatement or whatever else. That is almost a situation we are facing with onshore wind. Are you connected to the national grid? No. Will you be able to get access to the national grid? No. What are you going to do with it? Who cares? They don't care because they buy the land and there's currently prices are going up through the roof in the land, those that want to do something constructive with it, because they know they're going to get curtailment payments. That's the absurdity that we pay these suppliers more not to turn their turbines than we do to turn their turbines. So I think the time has come where, not just in the Loch Ness area, south of Inverness, where there's clear over-provision, it's also in South Ayrshire, it's also in Dumfries and Galloway. I've got it in Moray. There's 2 applications come in. We don't require it. So a moratorium on offshore wind. That's not to say that NAC don't review it at some stage, but at the present moment, why? Not simply because we no longer need it. There's also 2 issues. Because I remember speaking recently to NESO, and they won't give the information, but I managed to get from them that their current estimates are that by 2030, over 40% of onshore wind in the UK will come from Scotland. Over 40%. We are simply being used as a resource. We are getting nothing. But the difficulty is, if you look at the graphs and the work and try and analyse it, the growth in production capacity goes like that. The growth in the capacity of the grid to address it goes like that. So curtailment payments are not going to be reduced. Curtailment payments are going to increase. So it should stop. But it should also stop because it's onshore where we have the huge, offshore rather, where we have the huge opportunity. I mean, I come from with a flat in Dunbar, having stayed there, and I walk round the harbour, you can see the first of the turbines going in offshore. If you drive up the east coast of Scotland, whether it's off Angus, whether it's in the Murray Firth, whether it's further up in Caithness Bay, you can see offshore turbines. One offshore wind farm alone called Berwick Bank, it's not off Berwick, it's actually at the mouth of the River Forth. It will produce enough energy for 2.8 million households. 2.8 million households. We only have 2.3 million households in Scotland. 40% of it is already proposed to be taken directly south to a station by a cable south of the border. You know, we are getting no revenue, we are getting no jobs, we are getting no businesses located, but at least I think it makes the argument we don't need onshore. Onshore, moratorium. Offshore, we have to be taking a claim and a stake in these things. We equally also have to be getting the work. Because Berwick Bank, not just from Berwick Bank, but across from Dunbar, you've got Methil that lies empty. We are currently bringing in the turbines from Gamesa and Teesside, from the Netherlands, from Indonesia. The latest and the first of the floating offshore wind farm is currently actually facing the risk that the turbines will be manufactured in China. They will be brought round and they'll be assembled off the shores of Scotland. They won't even have to come ashore in Scotland. So that has to be chased. There are difficulties at the present moment. We're not able to make the turbines, but that can change, as I'll come on to. There are issues here because my party and I oppose free ports, but they exist. And until such time as a government, hopefully an independent Scottish government, says we're abolishing this, and let's remember free ports do come and free ports do go. Prestwick was a free port and it went, and at some stage even a Labour administration in London will realise let's change this game. But it's here. And we have to get the benefit of it. If you drive up past Neginyasu and Sumitomo, the Japanese company, they're putting in 2,000 jobs. The work there is massive. It is a huge opportunity. I went to Ardeshir. 20 years ago, it was McDermott's offshore and it shut. Anybody, go and have a look at it. I know there's difficulties because it's part of the free port, but I have to say, I've had the difficulties of being in government where you have to deal with the problems of a lack of success, where you have to deal with food banks, you have to deal with unemployment. Do you know the problems facing Haventus? The problem is that they can take 4,000 workers if they get it up and running as it should. Not just assembling turbines that have been pre-made, but actually manufacturing offshore wind turbines. They can employ 4,000 at the site alone. Where do you house 4,000 people? Well, I've already looked into that because now our travel to work takes you to Buckie, takes you down to Aviemore, takes you across. We can address it. It can be done. It's not going to be easy, but I can tell you this. I'd rather be dealing that than dealing with unemployment, food banks, and indeed so many youngsters having to leave. I do sometimes hear it. We're not having free ports here. I usually hear that from older people. It reminds me of another great Jimmy Reid story that he told about how he had been at some place where, when he was still in the shipyards and working with unions, and somebody was demanding, we need a general strike. Where do you work? Well, I'm a student. I have to say, I hear this. We don't want Ardeshir jobs. We don't want NIG. It's part of the Freeport. Where do you work? What your 16, 17, 18-year-old lad or lassie going to do? Do you want them to have to take the high road south, or do you want them to be able to get a job in the north of Scotland? And indeed, it just shouldn't be the north of Scotland. It should be every estuary in Scotland that replicates for this. It can be done. My brother, who's involved in this industry, was telling me he was overlooking at a factory in Denmark. That factory makes 70% of onshore turbines. 70%. It's the second, Denmark is the second highest wage levels in the whole of Europe. It's not low wage economy, it's a high wage economy. It's a very automated factory, so the numbers working are perhaps fewer than we would have remembered in the oil and gas industry, but it's a significant investment in the spin-off into other aspects because the opportunities for offshore wind are huge. I've told you the scale of there, but what people sometimes don't realise is the extent of what's going to be going out of our seas, not just into the North Sea. It can go into the, they're now embarking on the Celtic Sea, and I look forward to our Welsh cousins and Irish cousins doing well, but, we also have a West Coast as well. We are blessed by this. But, the size of the turbine blades for the next generation of offshore wind, 300 metres. That is the blade, not the turbine. And to give you some context, because people might say, well, what's 300 metres? The Eiffel Tower is 330 metres. So these turbines out there are going to be turning. And if you think there's a lot of power comes off Fenwick Moor or comes off any other onshore wind turbine, you can realise, you can see why Berwick Bank, when one wind farm alone will be able to produce it. So as I say, we have to make sure we get access to that. And at the present moment, we aren't. What's happening at the present moment? When I was still in Parliament, I went to a briefing by NESO, the National Electricity Supply Operator. And it was revelatory because they had a map. And they showed you basically where energy was being produced and where they needed to get energy to. And basically, it's being produced in Scotland, and that's why we are to get pylons that go from the north of Scotland down the east coast through the central borders to supply Liverpool and Manchester. We're getting no revenue, we're getting no jobs, we're getting no businesses located here because, I actually agree with the Chief Executive of Octopus. We need zonal pricing. We should be benefiting from this. We should be able to see cheap energy for our people, never mind the opportunity for businesses to choose to locate here. Rather than turning off turbines and paying curtailment, what you have to do is just off-grid links, and then businesses can run the power and the energy producer can be paid privately. All that needs to be done. But we've currently Ofgem and NESO who simply see Scotland as a resource, which is why at our Alba meeting we've made it quite clear, no zonal pricing for our people, then there should be no pylons. Don't give them planning permission. Why are they piloning it? Because a subsea cable is a factor of some 13 or 15 times more expensive, and an underground cable is a factor of some 8 or 9 times more expensive. So it's not that there's no alternative to pylons. It's that pylons are cheap, but we are to be used as a resource. Our environment is to be trashed, but we're not to get the benefit. But we should get the benefit. As I say, all of this should be allowing us to really motor. Not only do we need to start producing turbines, and we will if we do it at Ardeshir, we do it at NIG because Global Energy and other companies will go into NIG, but they should be going elsewhere. It's about time that Arnish got reopened in Isle of Lewis. It's about time that Bifab got reopened in Methil. It's about time that other places in the West Coast that we had for oil and gas are reopened. But it's not just the turbines. I remember Scottish SSEN, again, as an excuse when I said, are we getting the turbines? Oh, no, we've already put the orders in and they're going, Indonesia or Netherlands. And he said, but there's other things. Because let's remember, when you put in offshore turbines, you actually need to anchor them, especially if they're floating offshore. There you need not one anchor, not 4 anchors. You need something like 10, 8, 12 anchors. And it's the same actually with a lot of fixed turbines offshore. You require to have them anchored down because of the winds that come. And what they were pointing out to me is these anchors, every one has a chain, a linked chain. Every one of those links in the chain is probably my size. They're the height of a human being. We're not talking about a very small 1 foot or 2 foot. We are talking about massive chains because you have to be able to hold what is basically a floating rig. So it's not simply a rope with an old anchor that you would get for the anchor boys and the juniors of the BBs. This is a massive thing. Where are we going to make them? Why can't we be making them here? What about the subsea cables? We should be making them here. We're missing out on that at the present moment. It's not too late to turn it around. And that's the vision, because I think that can happen. And exactly the same as Denmark is the home of onshore wind, Scotland should be the home of offshore wind. But I can tell you about one site that grieves me. And if you go down to Eyemouth, you'll see N-Nagy. That's where they operate the Neart na Gaith offshore site from. And I welcome the limited number of jobs there. But let me tell you, Neart na Gaith, it's a Gaelic name. There's a clue there. But it's not Scots Gaelic. It's Irish Gaelic. Because who owns it? It's owned by EDF, the state operator from France, and ESB, the Irish State Electricity Board. The Irish Consul General told me it's the single biggest investment outside the island of Ireland that ESB has ever made. The profits aren't going to London. They're certainly not coming to Edinburgh. They're going to Dublin and to Paris. Who's building the turbines? I think the turbines were going down to Gamesa or wherever else. That was at least perhaps better than going even further abroad. Where was the cabling coming from? I think that was coming from Italy. Where were the ships being operating from? Some of them were coming from Belgium. There was nothing coming from Scotland. Well, he thought, well, maybe we'll get some jobs. One of my constituents thought it'd be a good thing. He'd been on the offshore tankers, and he thought, well, he lives in Pincaitlin. I'll come home and I can get a job going on the ship out of Montrose. He was on a ship out of Montrose for 2 days, and then we had a replication of what happened with P&O. Every UK seafarer was laid off by Fred Olsen, and on was brought South Asian labour. Why is that happening? Because if you operate outside the territorial waters, the 12-mile limit, then employment law and the minimum wage don't apply. That just shouldn't be happening. These companies should be told, the contract should have been signed. You'll buy here, you'll employ here, you'll base here. So as I say, I tell those stories because that's part of our underperforming. We missed out on oil and gas. We cannot miss out, as I say, on renewables. It's not too late. A lot of these contracts won't come through, but we do have to have an administration that gets a grip, that just doesn't hand it over. And people say, well, how do we know? Well, if we can't do it through skills or staff at Victoria Quay, then why don't we go and headhunt somebody from Norway? Why don't we say, whatever you want in a salary, we'll pay it. We'll give you a golden handcuff to keep you. We'll fly your family over every weekend. We'll do whatever you require. We'll put you up in Gleneagles. You come in and advise us how we get the best deal. It can be done, and it must be done. So that underpins the economy, because, it is going to be a European energy market. We are at the centre there. It's not just, if you listen to NESO, it's not just offshore wind. They will tell you about green hydrogen, because I'm conscious of time, I need to be winding up. But green hydrogen, 100% of green hydrogen is going to be manufactured in Scotland. 100% of the UK's green hydrogen. We should be quids in there, because what can you do with green hydrogen? Well, you can run vehicle fleets for the local authority. You can run buses. One of my best pals I used to play with was the Director General of Lothian Buses at one stage. And he told me, he says, we don't want electric buses. We want hydrogen buses, same as in Germany. He says, because our buses go out at 6 in the morning and they run until 12. The buses never stop running. If you get a Lothian bus, they pull in at the side, the driver jumps out, and another driver jumps in. The bus keeps going. We don't want to have to go back to Annandale Street or whatever else and recharge for 2 hours or 4 hours, never mind the size of the axle or whatever else. We want hydrogen buses. We should be able to be providing that cheap. There's the Scottish whisky industry is decarbonising and going towards hydrogen. It's not simply happening in distilleries. It was happening to me at maltings in Pincaitlin. They were putting in, and I spoke to people that were putting in the maltings. Will we have a surfeit of hydrogen? Yes. Will we be able to access it? Yes. East Lothian Council should be able to turn its fleet over to hydrogen vehicles, making everything significantly cheaper. So it's there. The economy can be transformed. We can be at the centre, and it ties in with what the universities and the skills have here, and that gives us the opportunity to make the country we want. Briefly on that, we need to build council houses. It's 100 years since John Wheatley, and the Labour government came in. Those of us old enough to remember, Wheatley houses are still the pinnacle of almost council housing in, the Scottish council estate. It Doesn't take rocket science to realise build council houses. Alec Neil has already said how you can access pension funds. There's money out there. That can be done. It's not rocket science to make sure that you buy and build your turbines here and you utilise it. It's not rocket science to say that, you buy your buses from your own factory and do that here, and you actually, when Alexander Dennis had a speciality in electricity and coming onto hydrogen, to manufacture that there. So that can be done. That's the Scotland we seek, and not a Scotland that's just about whinging and complaining. Yeah, I don't like, I very much welcome President Connolly. She'll be an outstanding civic leader. But it's not enough simply to be saying we don't want a criminal prince coming to stay in a palace in Scotland. It's about time we just proclaimed we want a Scottish Republic. So I end on that. I want a Scottish Republic with a society that cares for people, provides houses, provides health and education, addresses all these issues and goes from there. How do we achieve it? We need a plebiscite election. We need a plebiscite election. The threat has not gone away. Plaid Cymru don't stand in England. There's an existential threat coming to us from reform. Coming from Dunbar, he won't be like past UK Prime Ministers. He'll be more like Cromwell. They'll lay waste to our country, privatise our NHS, roll back our employment rights, even the limited ones we have, and destroy much of the fabric of our country. If we thought bad atmosphere was created after Brexit, you ain't seen nothing yet. How do you address it? You have to have a plebiscite election. You have to broaden the base, because the evidence is quite clear. The support for the SNP and support for independence is a gap that is ever widening. I'm not here to criticise beyond the legitimate points I've made, but what we're required to do is to make sure we get that maximised vote, and equally the time for begging for a referendum and the absurdity that you would consider going to Nigel Farage and asking for a referendum, frankly, is bollocks. That's why it has to be a plebiscite election. That is the mandate. That is what the Supreme Court authorised and said you could do, and that is what we have to do. Thank you for listening.